Well, the city of San Francisco is considering giving $5 million to each black descendant of slaves who lives in that city. I kid you not. They also want to allow blacks to be able to purchase a home for $1 when the average price of a home in that city is more than $1 million. They want to give $97,000 in income support to black descendants of slaves for the next 250 years. And that's just San Francisco. A California task force signed into law by Governor Gavin Newsom is recommending at least $250,000 for every black person who lives in California, a state which, by the way, was not even a slave state. Now, about reparations, here's what a skeptical President Barack Obama said back in 2016 to reparations proponent Ta-Nehisi Coates. More, by the way, about Mr. Coates later. Obama said this, and I'm quoting him: "It's hard to think of any society in human history in which a majority population has said that as a consequence of historic wrongs, we are now going to take a big chunk of the nation's resources over a long period of time to make that right. So the bottom line is that it's hard to find a model in which you can practically administer and sustain political support for those kinds of efforts," end of quote. Now, by the way, have you heard Obama weigh in on the growing reparations movement, something that, based on the quote I just read, he should be opposing? But as far as I know, mum's a word. Methinks he does not want to get canceled. After all, according to a Pew Research poll, 77% of black Americans support reparations, but only 18% of white Americans do. Now, the reparations issue has many problems. Reparations is the extraction of money from people who were never slave owners to be given to people who were never slaves. According to writer and radio host Michael Medved, a friend of mine, since so many of today's non-black Americans are descendants of post-Civil War immigrants, as few as 5% of today's whites have what he called a generational connection to slavery. A historian named Joseph Gottier at University of North Carolina estimates that 4.9% of the population, or 24.9% of households in slave states, own slaves. Of the free blacks living in the South, get this, some were slave owners. Famed historian Carter G. Woodson found that in 1830, 3,776 free Negroes owned 12,907 slaves. Historian Roger McGrath notes, and I'm quoting him, "Every one of the 13 states and most of the major cities that would become part of the Confederacy had substantial numbers of slave owners. New Orleans, by both numbers and by population," he said, "had the most. A staggering 28% of free blacks in the Crescent City owned slaves," end of quote. Now, those we call Native Americans also owned slaves. McGrath writes, and again I'm quoting him, "Accompanying the Cherokee on their trail of tears were some 2,000 black slaves. During the antebellum decade, slavery reached its peak among the 5 civilized tribes. The Cherokee, numbering only about 20,000 themselves, owned nearly 5,000 black slaves. The Choctaw, 2,500. The Creeks, 2,000. And the Chickasaw and the Seminole, about 1,000 each. Now, to protect their slave property, the 5 civilized tribes, except for a few dissident factions, sided with the Confederacy when the Civil War erupted," end of quote. Another problem, the government did not own slaves. People did. Almost all of them, by the way, Democrats. Dinesh D'Souza estimates that there were no more than 10 Republican slaveholders out of the 400,000 slave owners in 1860. The KKK was founded by Democrats. Congressional Democrats were overwhelmingly opposed to the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment. And as a percentage of their party, more Republicans voted for the Civil Rights Act of 1964 than did Democrats. Maybe the Democrats should sue themselves to pay for reparations. Got a question for you. Are you concerned with stock market volatility?
Markets closing in on their worst year since the financial crisis.
Since 2020, the Dow closed down more than 1,100 points.
Financial markets had their worst day since the start of the pandemic.
Do you really trust this economy?
The U.S. economy could be headed for a recession.
Tonight, the alarming spike in inflation soaring to its highest level in nearly 40 years.
What if you can invest in a portfolio with a high fixed rate of return that's not correlated to the stock market? Well, you can turn your monthly income on or off, compound it, whatever you choose, and get this, there is no loss of principal if you need your money back, and absolutely no fees. Just log on to investyrefy.com. Folks, I personally invest with my own money with YRefi. So log on to investyrefy.com or call 888-YREFI24. That's 888-YREFI24. Reparation proponents often say things like, well, slavery built America, or America was built on the backs of slaves. Now, the aforementioned Ta-Nehisi Coates testified at a recent congressional hearing on reparations where he made the following claim, and I'm quoting him. As historian Ed Baptiste has written, by 1836, more than 600 million, almost half of the economic activity in the U.S. derived directly or indirectly from the cotton produced by the million-odd slaves, end of quote. Half of the economic activity? Economics historian Philip Magnus says Baptiste, the man that Ta-Nehisi quoted, is wildly off. The correct number of the slave-based economic activity was the mid to high single digits, he says, not the 50% claim that Coates repeated. Now, how did Baptiste get it so wrong? Magnus writes the following. Baptiste adds up the total value of economic activity that derived from cotton production, which at 77 million made up about 5% of the estimated GDP of the U.S. in 1836. Baptiste then committed a fundamental accounting error. He proceeded to double, even triple count intermediate transactions involved in cotton production, things like land purchases for plantations, tools used for cotton production, transportation, insurance, and credit instruments used in each. Eventually, the 77 million became 600 million in Baptiste's accounting, or almost half of the entire antebellum economy of the U.S. Magnus says there's a crucial problem with Baptiste's approach. The calculation of GDP is the value of final goods and services produced. The price of the final good already incorporates intermediate transactions that go into its production and distribution. So, Baptiste's numbers are not only wrong, said Magnus, they reflect a basic unfamiliarity with the meaning and definition of GDP, end of quote. Oops. Now, if American taxpayers pay reparations, can they also sue Africa for its role in selling captured and enslaved Africans to Arab and European slavers? And more than 350,000 Union soldiers died, and another 250,000 suffered injuries in the Civil War. Should their descendants pay reparations to the descendants of slaves whose ancestors died in a war that resulted in their freedom? Last, where does Joe Biden stand on reparations? Well, he won't say, which says a lot.
Where does this administration stand on reparations for slavery and segregation and similar historic wrongs, specifically pertaining to Black Americans?
So look, we understand that there's a legislation on the Hill currently on the study of reparations, and we think Congress is the appropriate venue for consideration on such action, and so we're going to leave it there for Congress to decide to let them go through their process that they're taking at this moment. But I would lay out and speak to what the president has done.
Be interesting to know where Karine Jean-Pierre's family comes from. My guest is businessman, former University of California regent, and founder and chairman of the American Civil Rights Institute. He was the leader of the California Proposition 209 that got rid of race and gender-based preferences in state hiring, contracting, and college and university admissions. Please welcome Mr. Ward Connerly. Ward, always great to talk to you.
Larry, thank you, my friend. I've got to tell you, that was a brilliant monologue. Brilliant. I hope the legislature of California gets it, because that just destroys the whole rationale for reparations, which really goes back to the days of the late Congressman John Conyers, and was dismissed by most Americans and by the establishment because it made no sense then, and it certainly makes no sense now.
Ward, I remember he used to introduce, every time there was a new congressional legislative session, he would introduce a bill for reparations and got no support. People thought he was a clown. He did it every 2 years, every 2 years, every 2 years. And now look at where we are.
Well, I'll tell you, we can look at this from so many vantage points. As an American, I think of John F. Kennedy's words about ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. Makes no sense. You're absolutely right about California being a free state. My family came here from Louisiana in the mid-40s in search of greater freedom. And the state is not disappointed in that regard. And as a person, I come from Louisiana. My mother died when I was 4. I am of Irish and Choctaw and Creole descent on my mother's side. On my father's side, who I didn't see for 55 years, my great-grandmother was born a slave, Sarah Ford. She eloped from the ranch, which I guess you'd call a plantation. She was born a slave, but she later eloped from the plantation with the son of her owner, and they moved to Leesville and established a family. So that's the complicated history of race in this country, and we're not going to get beyond it with goofy ideas like this.
So, Ward, I would imagine you're going to get like 16% of a check, maybe, if that. And Ward, you mentioned John Kennedy. I remember reading about an interview that he had in circa 64, probably circa 62. And he was asked about what we now call affirmative action, although that wasn't the word that was used. Do you believe there should be a preferential treatment for black people? He said no. He said the wrongs are the wrongs. All we can do now is be fair going forward.
He also famously said, race has no place in American life or law. And those words are words that I think President Biden should heed as we go forward. If we have any hope at all of ever getting beyond race, reparations will give us another 60 years of equity and affirmative action, which will destroy it for any hope that we have. As a member of the Melanin Caucus, I say that I just don't want this. I will not accept any reparations. I know you won't, Larry. And we want to get beyond race, but we're not going to do it until we get rid of all consciousness about race. This is not going to get it.
Well, Ward, it's not going to happen, the $5 million. Although if a $5 million check suddenly popped up in my mailbox, I'm not sure. I'm not sure it's going to sit around without being cashed. Now, Ward, talk to me about the support for reparations on the part of so many blacks. I mentioned one poll, I think it was a Pew poll, 77% of blacks support reparations. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I think they better read the bill because of San Francisco and the legislature. I think that most black people won't qualify for this. This is a sure way. And this is the thing that disturbs me most, Larry, is if you want to unite Democrats and Republicans and conservatives and liberals against black people, this will do it. This makes people like me the target for everybody, the rhetorical target. Everybody's going to say those people are getting what they don't deserve once again. And it just puts a political target on the backs of poor people, of black people, and they're trying to seduce us into thinking that there's going to be this big paycheck. It's not going to happen. It's teasing black people.
And Ward, let's stick with California for a second, where you and I both are. As I pointed out, California was not a slave state. So what to do? The task force is concentrating on what they call housing discrimination. This took place in 1920, 1930, 1940, 1950s. Well, a lot of people were discriminated against in housing. Jews were. Asian Americans were. There was a law that forbade Chinese Americans from owning farmland in California. Chinese Americans who wanted to go into the laundry business were discriminated against in San Francisco. And nationwide, there was the Chinese Exclusion Act, which wasn't repealed until several decades later. Everybody has a cause. Everybody could moan about something. Women didn't have the right to vote until the Constitution was amended. And after that, state spending expanded in states that didn't have the right to vote for women before. So you could make the argument that had women had the right to vote, a lot more benefits would have been conferred on them had they had the right to vote. So everybody could make an argument, Ward. Who couldn't make an argument?
That's right. That's why I think the San Francisco legislation would give reparations to African Americans who were affected by substance abuse, also by eminent domain of urban renewal.
Right.
That freeway that you drive in San Francisco, reparations would be given to those whose property was taken at their market value. Mm-hmm. This is an insane idea.
You know, Ward, again, we're in California. You recall Senator S.I. Hayakawa. There was a debate over whether or not there should be reparations for people that were put in Japanese relocation camps. And he opposed it, even though these reparations were going to the people whose property were taken or their legal heirs. And the reason he opposed it was because he says you're opening the door for other people to make other grievances. Now, it's one thing to give money to people who were themselves hurt or their heirs, but this slavery ended over 150 years ago. It's impossible to do that. My point is, even for that, S.I. Hayakawa predicted exactly what would happen, which is other people would come forward and say, we've got a grievance too.
I can't think of any one group other than white male that would not qualify for this. You've got women, you've got immigrants who toil in our vineyards in the Central Valley, who could argue that this is not, that they have a grievance. Women, 50% of the population whose roles were predetermined, who would say, I would be president now were it not for the conditions that I face, reparations for me. So there's hardly a soul that would not qualify for reparations.
And Ward, isn't it interesting? We're talking about reparations, but we're not talking about the 10,000-pound elephant in the room, which is the huge number of blacks who enter the world without a father in the home, married to the mother. 70%, right, up from 25% back in 1965. And forget about elder. Barack Obama said a kid raised without a dad is 5 times more likely to be poor and commit crime, 9 times more likely to drop out of school, and 20 times more likely to end up in jail. Now, we're not even talking about how the welfare state has incentivized women to marry the government and incentivized men to abandon their financial and moral responsibility. That's what we ought to be talking about, but we're not.
Well, you're right. And we also ought to be talking about the illegal immigrants who are flooding our border. We should be talking about the cobblestone streets that need to be fixed. We need to be talking about inflation. Instead, they're messing around with something that they will never deliver. But in the meantime, they're going to make some black people think that there is low-hanging fruit there, which they won't get. They're going to be disappointed, angry. This is not an idea that is worthy of debate, but yet it's going to be.
And Ward, 85% nationwide black 8th graders, these are kids who are 13 years old, can neither read nor do math at grade proficiency. Half of them can't do reading at basic proficiency, which means a substantial number of black 13-year-olds are functionally illiterate. Where's the debate? Where's the discussion on that?
Yeah, you're right. You're right. It's not an idea whose time has come. It left and passed a long time ago. John Conyers took it with him even.
Finally, Ward, a couple of political questions. Why do you suppose Joe Biden has not said a peep? And why do you suppose Obama has not weighed in on this? He's weighed in on all sorts of things since he's become president. But regarding this rising support in the black community anyway for reparations, I haven't heard him say a word.
And you won't. And you won't, because this is something that I think if the American people had a chance to vote on this, 75 to 80% would say no, hell no. And yet you have black people, all of us, they're taking the social hit that we're a bunch of slovenly people, sniveling, slovenly people who always want something for nothing. And most of the people won't get anything from this anyway.
Right. Well, as you know, and as you've proven, whenever the issue of affirmative action has been put before the voters, even in a liberal state like California, it has failed. They tried to repeal it a little while ago. It also failed. Can you imagine putting reparations on the ballot?
It would fail even more. And I was in a conversation with Pacific Legal yesterday, and there are so many ways to attack this legally. It's unconstitutional. It's unconstitutional. So we're looking very closely at filing the suit against this, Larry, because what happens in California has a possibility of spreading elsewhere.
Absolutely.
And we don't want that to happen.
Ward Connerly, thank you very much for your time. God bless.
You too, Larry. Thanks.
Now, I know you love the show. And if you do, show your love. Hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and then scroll down and join our mailing list. Why, you ask? Well, believe it or not, from time to time, YouTube seems to have some issues with some of our vids. I don't know why. Maybe they're a little too hard-hitting. To make sure we continue giving you hard-hitting, candid programming, be sure to get on that mailing list and also throw something in the tip jar. Make sure the shows keep coming. Show your love. Throw something in the tip jar. 2-drink minimum. And also LarryWithEpoch.com, LarryWithEpoch.com. I am Larry Elder. This has been the Larry Elder Show for Epoch Times. Remember, we've got a country to save. I'll see you next time.